The neighbors heard her screaming. Someone even stood up and walked to their door, but no one opened it. When police arrived the next morning, they found her body exactly where those screams came from. A single line in the official report would later summarize the entire tragedy. No action was taken. This is the story of Natalie Brooks. A story that isn't about a monster hiding in the shadows, but about the silence that allowed him to succeed. It's a haunting reminder of how easily we can convince ourselves that it's not our problem. 3 days before she died, Natalie Brooks, 31 years old, moved into a small apartment complex in Phoenix, Arizona. It was a fresh start. She was building a new life, working late shifts at a local restaurant to make ends meet. She lived alone and mostly kept to herself. When police later asked her neighbors about her, the descriptions were almost identical. Quiet, polite, seemed normal. She was just another face in the hallway, someone you'd nod to but never really know. Nothing about her stood out, and that anonymity, in the end, would be a fatal disadvantage. The night it happened was September 6, 2020, at 11:42 p.m. The building's security camera captured Natalie returning home from her shift. The footage is mundane, ordinary. She's alone, carrying her bag, looking a little tired. She walks down the hallway to her apartment, unlocks her door, and steps inside. The door closes firmly behind her. That was the last time anyone saw Natalie Brooks alive. Just 36 minutes later, at approximately 12:18 a.m., the silence on her floor was broken. Residents began hearing noises coming from Natalie's apartment. At first, it sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. A muffled thump. Then, voices. They were raised, but indistinct. And then came the scream. It wasn't a scream of anger or frustration. One neighbor would later tell detectives, it didn't sound like a fight. It sounded like pure fear. The sound was so piercing, so raw, that another resident admitted he paused his television, the remote still in his hand. He sat in the sudden silence of his own apartment and just waited. He strained to hear more, but after a few moments, the screaming stopped. Everything went quiet again. So he unpaused his show, and the noise of the TV filled his apartment once more, drowning out the silence from next door. And here is the most chilling part of the story. In that critical window of time, not one person picked up the phone to call 911. Not a single door was knocked on. No one shouted down the hall to ask if everything was okay. The reasons given to investigators later paint a familiar picture of collective inaction. One neighbor said she assumed it was just a domestic argument. She didn't want to get involved in someone else's private business. Another neighbor admitted the thought crossed his mind to call for help, but he figured someone else would probably call. He was sure he wasn't the only one who heard it. Someone else would handle it. Perhaps most hauntingly, one resident confessed that the screams prompted her to get up from her couch. She walked to her front door, her hand hovering over the deadbolt. She listened. The hallway was silent. She convinced herself she was overreacting, that it was nothing. Then, she quietly locked her door and went back to bed. Every single person on that floor made a choice, and their collective choice was to do nothing. The next morning, at 8:07 a.m., a maintenance worker doing his rounds noticed something was wrong. The door to Natalie's apartment was slightly ajar. It was unusual. He called out her name, but there was no response. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. The apartment was still and silent. He found Natalie on her bedroom floor. It was immediately clear she was gone. The cause of death was later confirmed as homicide. Investigators noted there were no signs of a break-in, suggesting Natalie had either let her attacker in, or the attacker had found a way in without using force. Detective Aaron Mitchell was assigned to lead the investigation. His team began the painstaking work of canvassing the building, starting with Natalie's immediate neighbors. He interviewed every single resident on her floor, and a disturbing pattern quickly emerged. Every person he spoke to reported hearing something, a thump, a shout, a scream, and every single person also reported doing nothing. They had no eyewitnesses, no clear suspect. The case was turning into a frustrating dead end. But then, they found something that changed everything. Lying on her kitchen counter was Natalie's cell phone. Detective Mitchell picked it up. The screen was black, the battery dead. But when his team charged it and turned it on, they discovered the heartbreaking truth. The call log showed a single, desperate attempt to get help. An emergency call, placed at 12:21 a.m., right in the middle of when her neighbors heard the noises. But the call had never connected. It was dropped before it ever reached a 911 operator. Phone records confirmed the call lasted only a few seconds. Moments later, her phone battery died, plunging her into darkness and silence. That's when she screamed. After her one technological lifeline failed her, Natalie did the only thing she had left to do. She screamed for her life, believing, hoping, that someone would hear her, and they did. The entire floor heard her. Her voice was her last desperate attempt to be saved. In the aftermath, no charges were ever filed against the neighbors. Legally, they hadn't broken any laws. There's no law that compels you to be a good Samaritan. The investigation into Natalie's death eventually stalled due to a lack of evidence and witnesses willing to come forward with more than just what they heard. Within 4 months, the case was officially closed, unsolved. Natalie Brooks became another statistic, another name in a file cabinet. But her story serves as a brutal lesson. We often think that tragedies happen in silence, in deserted places where no one is around to help. But Natalie's story proves that's not true. Sometimes, the most dangerous place to be is surrounded by people who are all waiting for someone else to act. Natalie didn't die because no one heard her screams. She died because everyone did. Thank you for watching. If this story impacted you, please consider sharing it. It's a conversation we need to have. And if you're new here, please subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told.